Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Bastian Giegerich. I'm the Director of Defense and Military Analysis here at the Institute at the ISS. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to today's event on the key security and defense issues for the new UK government. You all know that the ISS, the focus of the Institute is international and global, but of course we do look at the important strategic debates in this country, as we have done around the time of the last SDSR, which we have treated actually over the years with quite some detail and quite a bit of analysis, among other places in the military balance. At this point, of course, relatively little is known about the detail that will drive the Strategic Defense and Security Review that we all expect. But that should not stop us from beginning that careful look at key issues ahead of us. One, of course, being, do we think the threat has gone up? If so, what does that imply for capabilities? And what does that imply for spending and other issues? And I have with me four colleagues to help us sift through these issues. To my immediate left, Nigel Inkster, who is our Director of Transnational Threats and Political Risk, who kindly agreed to join us today, and he will actually start. Followed by Giri Rajendran, who is our defense economist, research associate for defense and economics, who is then followed by Brigadier Ben Barry, our senior fellow for land warfare, and last but not least, Douglas Barry, our senior fellow for military aerospace. They will all speak 5, 6, 7 minutes so that we have some time for discussion at the end. And I do not want to take up any more time. So Nigel, I will hand over to you, and I assume you will speak on some issues having to do with terrorism, counterterrorism, intelligence, and cyber.
Yeah, thank you very much, Bastian, and good afternoon, everybody. In the 2010 SDSR, I formed part of a small group of grey-haired has-beens who were invited to come and review some of the issues that were being discussed and to contribute to some of them. And when, in the aftermath of the SDSR 2010, we had the usual cries of pain from retired generals, admirals, etc., about the collapse of the British defence system and capability, I was at pains to remind people who were interested to listen that this was a strategic defence and security review, and that a significant element of what we were talking about was not about conventional armed forces in terms of tanks, ships, planes, etc., but it was about things like intelligence capabilities. It was, in particular, about cyber capabilities. These things that are becoming increasingly critical in terms of any nation's ability to conduct an effective defence policy. And of course, one thing it's worth emphasizing in all of this, I would say this, wouldn't I, given my background, but I believe it to be true, is that the United Kingdom remains a front-rank intelligence power in the world, Edward Snowden revelations notwithstanding. That constitutes a significant strength. We do have a signals intelligence agency, a foreign intelligence agency, that are unquestionably in the Premier League. And I don't expect that to change because, of course, the range of threats and preoccupations that this government faces are driven still to a significant degree by the kind of asymmetric threats presented by actors such as Islamic State, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and other kind of clones of the global jihadist movement, and this, I think this requirement, is fixed. It's going to remain, and I would anticipate that, or I'd be very surprised if the single intelligence vote budget that covers the three agencies was not at least kept where it is, if not somewhat increased. The other thing about the SDSR 2010 that was very significant, and I'd like to think I had a small hand in, was the whole question of investment in cyber capabilities. And as we know, the sum of £650 million was allocated to develop national cyber capabilities. Now, I don't know how many times that 650 million has actually been spent. To answer that question, you'd have to go to the to HM Treasury's Department of Creative Bookkeeping, which, as everybody knows, is the biggest department in HM Treasury. But the fact is that this money has been spent, largely, and it has been spent, I think, in a reasonably sensible and intelligent manner. I mean, every military, every country is struggling with the whole question of how you engage within the cyber domain, within the defense context, and the kind of capabilities you need, the balance between defense and offensive capabilities, and the extent to which these things are seen as a top-tier strategic capability, or to what extent they are simply seen as something that is deployed within the battle space to shape the immediate environment and agenda, and the whole question of how information operations takes place within a modern battle space. All these debates are ongoing, but the fact is, that again, we have in GCHQ a world-class capability that is able to deploy significant resources to this end. We've seen the MOD starting to engage very seriously in the development of these capabilities, and that is the other area that I would expect to see continued focus on in whatever review takes place in the autumn.
Nigel, thank you very much for kicking us off. So the UK needs to remain an intelligence power along the lines that you've outlined to maintain its standing. Giri, the budget.
Thanks, Bastian. UK defence spending is today, in real terms, about 19% lower than it was in 2010. Around half of this has been as a result of core budgetary cuts, the remainder the product of the winding down of operations in Afghanistan. So it's understandable that a substantial part of the defence-related debate in the run-up to the election was over further cuts to the UK defence budget, and the sub-question of whether or not it would meet the 2% NATO percentage of GDP target. However, the results of the election are such that the budgetary picture for the MOD is now looking relatively more benign than at any point during the campaign. Overall, it seems to me that there are now two effective realities facing the UK defence: the fiscal reality versus the political reality, which, to my mind, do not quite add up. I will go through each before concluding. On the fiscal side of things, I think there are at least 5 moving parts which affect the effective level of resourcing defence will be able to count on over the next Parliament: GDP growth, tax rate adjustments, Scottish fiscal autonomy, prioritisation between departments, and deficit reduction. On the GDP growth front, while the economy has been improving, the forecast is now for lower rates of growth than earlier projected. For example, the Bank of England lowered February's optimistic forecasts for this year down from 2.9% growth to 2.6%. That is one moving part that will have to be contended with. The second is tax rate adjustments, but Cameron seems to have reduced his room for manoeuvre here over the course of the election with the proposal to legislatively ban tax rises to 2020, covering some 70% of revenues and including bans on increasing main rates of income tax, VAT, and national insurance. The third potential question centres around Scottish fiscal autonomy and the degree to which that will occur. Negotiations are still in an early stage, but for example, last Wednesday it emerged that the SNP would demand control over 9 billion of Scottish national insurance contributions from the UK, which would remove what was previously a UK shared resource. So there's a question there. Fourthly, on the prioritisation between departments, there has not been an explicit ring fence for defence, but as I will come to earlier, there may be an effective implicit ring fence on parts of the defence budget. So unlike the schools budget and health, that remains another moving part. And finally, deficit reduction targets. A low inflation environment and a growth environment would seemingly permit pushing to the right of deficit reduction targets, but the centrality of this to the Conservative Party's economic narrative will not. And on current plans, some 30 billion in public spending cuts and reduced tax avoidance will have to be achieved by 2018 to eliminate the deficit. What does this mean for defense? On spending, the Conservative Party election manifesto's central message is, we can, and I quote, "We can only have a strong, well-funded armed forces by continuing to build a stronger economy." So clearly, economic growth through the much vaunted long-term economic plan, a central plank of which has been deficit reduction and reducing the size of the state relative to the economy as a whole, has been prioritized over armed forces funding. There has been no explicit commitment to maintaining the 2% of NATO GDP target. And indeed, this year, the 2% will only be achieved through the incorporation of things like war pensions, previously included elsewhere, but which qualify under the NATO definition of defense spending, into the defense budget, as well as through a rounding effect. NATO reports figures to 1 decimal place, so the projected 1.98% of GDP to be allocated to defense spending this year will eventually go down in history as being rounded up to 2%. So that's on the fiscal reality. Turning to the political reality, it's difficult to see how this funding picture squares with current political aspirations. If you look at the Conservative manifesto, there's plenty of mention of the equipment plan to be funded by 1% in real terms over the next parliament. It also states the size of the regular armed forces will be maintained at current levels, including the army, which will not be reduced to below 82,000. The fleet of 4 successor ballistic missile submarines will be built, and a continuous Trident deterrent will be retained. And both new aircraft carriers will be brought into service, so one is available for use at all times. Taken together, this constitutes some 70% of the entire defense budget, which means, in a political sense, much of the defense budget has effectively been ring-fenced. So the question is where savings can be made. One would assume that most of the easiest efficiencies have already been achieved. Perhaps a defense land sell-off might raise some funds, or changing the personnel structure to replace higher paid senior personnel with more junior ranks while still maintaining the 82,000 overall total might be another option. Certainly training, infrastructure spending and civilian personnel are all likely candidates to be cut. And this morning's announcement of up to 100,000 jobs in Whitehall to be cut over the next 5 years, as $10 billion in Whitehall cuts by 2017 are attempted, right, maybe gives us an early indication of where the reductions government-wide might fall. Despite the civil service overall being at its smallest level since the Second World War, after losing some 90,000 jobs over the preceding parliament. So to conclude, with 70% of the defense budget effectively ring-fenced, the net effect might actually be a small real terms uptake in defense outlays over the next couple of years. As a thought experiment, with a 1% uplift in the equipment and support budget, which totals about 40% of total spending, if the rest of the budget remained flat, that would equate to a 0.4% increase in outlays annually. But with considerable pay restraint seen in recent years, personnel outlays may have to rise to compete with the private sector, where real wages have started to increase. With the force size pledged to remain at current levels, this could result in a further increase. Of course, plans could change according to new circumstances and economic realities. In other words, the moving parts, which I spoke about earlier, could move. The next comprehensive spending review, due by the end of the year, may change things. But in the short term, a key date will be July the 8th, when the Chancellor delivers his emergency budget, which incorporates the changes laid out in the Conservative Party manifesto. For the moment, though, it appears that the MOD has gotten away with a better deal than anyone would have expected prior to the elections. And the more immediate questions may likely turn to questions not over resources, but what is done with those resources in the world, something that my colleague Ben will likely expand upon. Thank you.
Kiri, thank you very much, and for pointing out that this, taking the manifesto at face value amounts to ring-fencing 70% of the defense budget. I think that's an important insight that I'm not sure was well understood until you mentioned it. Ben, please, over to you for treatment of a couple of strategic issues and, of course, also some Army priorities. Ben, please.
What are the key issues? Well, the first one is, will the UK retain the same security and defence strategy? The Conservative Party manifesto seemed to imply so. All its proposals for defence are those that were already set in hand by the previous government. So it looks like it wants to continue with what was decided in 2010. The manifesto also said, "We have strengthened Britain's influence in the world." There are many commentators who would beg to differ, and the evidence presented in the manifesto does not clearly support this proposition. The case against is the decision to have a small presence in Afghanistan after 2015, smaller than, say, the German or Italian presence. The September 2013 parliamentary vote vetoing UK strikes on Syria. The accumulated delays last year in deciding to contribute British forces to the US-led coalition against ISIS. Now, these and other indicators suggested strategic caution. Understandably, this reflects popular dissatisfaction with the cost, difficulty and intractability of British operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, these factors, together with the reductions in conventional forces, the Conservative Party's refusal to commit to meeting NATO's 2% of GDP defence spending target over the long term, despite the Prime Minister having previously endorsed it at last September's NATO summit, in aggregate, they will have done nothing to strengthen UK military influence with the US, with France, in NATO, and in the Gulf and Asia. So the second key issue for the government is whether or not it wants to increase UK military strategic credibility with its allies. Another key issue, which is going to play probably through the life of this current Parliament, UK politics. Rejection of independence by Scots voters in last year's referendum removed the risk posed to British military capability, particularly the potential need to move the Rosyth nuclear facilities out of Scotland. It currently seems unlikely that this will resurface as an issue in a short term, but the EU membership negotiations and subsequent referendum will have defence implications, including potential political friction between the UK and key EU members. If the UK leaves, there are possible security consequences, and any resulting economic turbulence or damage would threaten defence spending. And many US commentators assert that the US values the UK's membership of the EU, so UK influence with the US could be further eroded. The 2010 National Security Strategy and SDSR did a respectable effort to analyse the threat to the UK and its interest. And I would commend to you the fact sheets that were produced in the last SDSR. Fact sheet 2, the National Security Risk Assessment, and fact sheet 1, our approach to the National Security Strategy. Now, it's not clear from its manifesto whether the government thinks the overall threat has decreased, increased, or stayed the same. Of course, there is always a danger that any analysis of threats will only identify increased threats and not any areas where it's reduced. But it's worth checking our current perceptions of the threat against those published in 2010. There are 4 Tier 1 threats: a cyber threat, an international military crisis between states, international terrorism affecting the UK, or a major accident or natural hazard. Do any of those look as if they've gone down? You could argue Russia-Ukraine is an international military crisis between states drawing in the UK. And in Tier 2, there's a threat of major instability, insurgency or civil war overseas, which creates an environment that terrorists can exploit to threaten the UK. Well, that seems to have been happening for the last year with ISIS. In the third tier, there's a threat of a conventional attack by a state on another NATO or EU member, to which the UK would have to respond. Well, after Ukraine, certainly in the eyes of NATO, that threat's definitely gone up and doesn't seem likely to go down in the short term. So I think as you think about this, it's well worth revisiting that tier assessment of threats that was made in the National Security Strategy. Now, with regard to NATO, the UK has contributed to NATO's increased deployments to Eastern Europe. It's endorsed NATO's Readiness Action Plan, for example, assigning US troops to the new NATO Spearhead Force in 2017. Now, any reaction forces sent to reassure NATO allies or deter any Russian mischief have to be credible. That is, to have sufficient combat power to counter Russian capabilities, which requires high-intensity combat in contested battle space. I suspect a frank audit of the British service's ability to conduct such operations would reveal a number of challenges. So another key issue for the government is the extent to which high-intensity combat capability is required and whether countering modernised Russian forces should be its benchmark. If the answer is yes, there is work to be done on rebuilding capabilities that have atrophied over the last decade. If the answer is yes, it also implies a requirement to defend the UK against a major state-sponsored cyber attack. How that defence would be conducted, indeed who would be in charge of it, is not clear to me. It also requires a revival of the UK's maritime and air defence capabilities. Another key issue is whether the government wants to do more in other areas, for example, defence engagement, partnership and capacity building. Does it want to do more in key strategic regions, the Gulf or the Asia Pacific? And does it want to play a greater role in UN or international missions? There's also the issue of the relative priority of UK capabilities. For example, if the government chooses to prioritise the nuclear deterrent, the military contribution to Five Eyes intelligence sharing, and the UK Special Forces, all of which give the UK great strategic influence, would this prioritisation be at the expense of conventional forces? Now, moving on to the UK's conventional forces, despite the 20 to 30% reduction in capability and the lowering of levels of readiness, they still field a wide range of capabilities and are balanced between combat support, logistics and strategic lift. And they retain a robust can-do military culture, and the Army and the Air Force have a generation of proven leaders. But in many areas they're close to critical mass. And for example, in the Army, there are a number of innovative new formations that reflect hard lessons of the last decade. But where it previously had 5 heavy brigades, it now has 3, and their capability depends on funding the modernisation of the Army's armoured vehicle fleets. It's also more dependent on reserves, which is, in some respects, a considerable risk to the Army's readiness. And that illustrates some of the key issues, once you start looking at the conventional forces, that the government itself might, and the forces, might need to grapple with.
Thank you, Ben. Douglas, please. Aerospace and probably also some defense industrial aspects.
Yeah. Okay. Good afternoon. Yeah, it is good afternoon, everybody. I'll briefly look at fast jet numbers, maritime patrol aircraft, carrier-enabled power projection, and a little bit in ballistic missile defence. I'll also make a couple of comments about defence industrial base issues. By the way, when you Google carrier-enabled power projection, the first hit you get is no longer available on gov.uk, which I hope isn't a kind of harbinger of things to come. SDSR 2010 was really a kind of make-do, and in the case of financing the longer-term equipment programme, one of mend. Combat aircraft numbers continued to be cut. With fleet rationalisation, the Harriers were chopped. The choice was between the Harrier and the GR4. The GR4 survived, the Harrier didn't. It was purely a savings measure. The basic premise of the SDSR 2010 with regard to combat air still holds. The 2010 document said, and I quote, "In terms of the Royal Air Force, by the 2020s it will be based around a fleet of 2 of the most capable fighter jets anywhere in the world, a modernised Typhoon fleet fully capable of air-to-air and air-to-ground missions," and I think that fully capable of air-to-ground missions is a very interesting statement, which is still to be fully realised, and the Joint Strike Fighter, the world's most advanced multi-role combat aircraft. There remain, however, issues in terms of those aspirations that may well be been addressed within work strands of the coming SDSR. The first of these is simply one of mass. The Typhoon Tranche 1 fleet is due to be withdrawn over the course of this year out to 2018, and at present March 2019 is the planned out of service date for the last of the Tornado GR4 squadrons, of which 3 remain. These squadrons presently provide the RAF's long-range ground attack role. This will leave the Air Force with a total of 107 Typhoon Tranche 2, Tranche 3 aircraft once the deliveries of the Tranche 3 aircraft are all completed. Alongside the 5 frontline Typhoon squadrons, the first F-35B squadron will reach a land-based initial operational capability in 2018 according to current plans. The carrier-based IOC is due to follow in 2020. The Block 4 software on which a lot of the weapons capability for the F-35 is based, which will come along in probably 4 increments, actually doesn't start to be released until 2021-22, and that's assuming that the present timelines are held. Therefore, the initial F-35B capability in the UK, as indeed in the US and elsewhere, will be comparatively limited. From 2019 to 2025, at the very least, there's going to be a lot of reliance on the Typhoon. The need to deliver the improved surface-to-air capability on time is obviously extremely important. This is based around Storm Shadow, currently integrated in the GR4, and Brimstone 2, which is now coming into service. Also, the Typhoon out-of-service date is presently planned for 2030, which actually isn't that far away. So there is a near-term choice of either now planning and extending the service life of the aircraft and making the required funding available, or beginning to think about procuring a replacement for that date. I think the former is far more likely. I would anticipate that the Typhoon service life is extended at least out to 2035 and possibly more out towards 2040. Turning to maritime patrol, the gapping of the MPA capability in the 2010 SDSR was one of its most incoherent elements. Perhaps was a case of give something up that you knew you could actually argue to get back successfully. Obviously, the personnel capability was retained through the Seacorn project that was farming out crews to other operators who continued in the MPA business, so that if we could get an aircraft back into service, then you had crews which you could draw on. You can't do that forever, and I would expect that the SDSR actually begins to address this in some form or another. There are a number of more or less costly and more or less capable platform options being proposed, and it would seem likely that the SDSR revisit this. The requirement could be couched in terms of an aircraft with a significantly wider capability, however, than a traditional MPA role, with an expanded intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance role. There's also perhaps an area with the E-3D AWACS aircraft and its out-of-service date, which may play into the consideration of an MPA platform choice. Turning now more to the naval side of the House, with regard to carrier-enabled power projection, I think clarity on the role of the second vessel and the size and composition of the air wing it would carry would be welcome within the next SDSR. Finally, a brief comment on BMD, ballistic missile defence. There is renewed interest in some aspects of ballistic missile defence, and again this could feature in the SDSR in the context of maritime developments. The Type 45 destroyer could form the basis of a UK BMD deployable capability to areas such as the Persian Gulf. Thank you. Don't run away, Bastian, you've got to come back.
Thank you, Doug. Thank you very much. Just thought it would be advisable to close that door since there's a bit of noise in the background. Thank you very much. Given that my colleagues have all been very disciplined regarding timekeeping, we do have a little over half an hour for questions and discussion. Please catch my eye if you would like to ask a question. There was a question in the very back there. Sir, if you could just raise your hand again so that a microphone, do we have a roving microphone? Yes, can we get that to the gentleman over there? If you could please identify yourself briefly, and if you're directing the question to a particular panel member, it would be great if you let us know.
Thank you. Name's Mahmoud Ali, a member of the Institute. Question for the panel. Is there a debate at the moment in the political classes as to Britain's place in the world, which must surely determine budgetary, organizational, and procurement frameworks? If there is, enlighten us. If not, why not? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there other questions at this stage? Somebody's beeping. Okay, thank you. Yes, please, over here. We'll collect a few questions. Can we get a microphone to the gentleman in the fourth row? Thank you.
Thanks, Rob McCare. Yeah, a sort of linked question really, whether anyone on the panel feels that the considerably generous funding for the aid budget and other wider aspects of the UK's overseas presence has any bearing on this upcoming defence and security review.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to take a third question in this round. Yes, please. Adrian here in the first row. Microphone is coming.
Okay. I wonder how the panel thinks about the the development of the 2015 SDSR in the light of the planning for the NATO summit in Warsaw in July 2016.
Thank you very much. I'll come back to Q&A in the second round, but let's take those three. First, Britain's place in the world, the aid budget, and SDSR and NATO summit. Gary, do you want to start with a few words on the budget? Because it relates to ministerial priorities and the competition, the moving parts that you spoke to, even though that's less of a moving part.
Yeah. I'm not sure I have a huge amount to add to what I've already said in terms of the aid budget. Obviously, it's another of those moving parts. It contributes to the overall spend. There is some who think that, given its ring-fence status, maybe that's not appropriate. But I think the moving parts are a lot more on the revenue side of the equation, whether they can get the tax revenues up, and also over the deficit reduction targets. I mean, the Chancellor 5 years ago set out a deficit reduction plan, and effectively he met, I think, Alistair Darling's plan. And so it may be the case that this year he sets out his own plan, but actually meets Ed Ball's plan. So deficit reduction, the pace of that, I think, is a really significant factor. I don't actually think that the aid budget will make too much of a difference offhand. Thanks.
Nigel, you also had some thoughts on the aid budget. Maybe you also want to say a few words on Britain's role in the world.
On the aid budget, I mean, this is actually quite a complicated debate. It tends to reduce itself to a bumper sticker. We're spending X, imagine what we could do with it if we weren't spending it on all these indigent foreigners. In fact, I would argue that, relatively speaking, the UK aid budget, 0.7% of GDP, is not that massive. A country this wealthy can well afford it. And the general proposition that it represents, if you like, an insurance policy that seeks to create greater stability and hence less risk of instability and violence in countries which nowadays has the potential to visit itself, back here in the UK homeland, has some validity. And I think many people in my former profession, in the defence establishment generally, don't have a particular problem with aid budget. I think there is a question about whether this situation we've got at the moment, whereby DFID is effectively unconstrained by any need to observe UK wider policy priorities in dispensing this budget, is something necessarily that should continue. The other thing, of course, is that we should bear in mind in all of this that aid is a very poor alternative to free trade, and if we really wanted to make an impact on the economies of developing countries vulnerable to instability, probably what we ought to be doing is sorting out the EU's common agricultural policy and enable these countries actually to pay their own way in the world, rather than, as we currently do, erect artificial barriers to their doing so. As to Britain's place in the world, well, it's very noteworthy that this was one subject that was absent from the public debates in the run-up to the recent election. And at the moment, my sense is that this is an issue that is largely the preserve of a few public intellectuals and commentators. It is not at the heart of UK political discussion at the moment. But I suspect that there's something cyclical in this. That a lot of what we're seeing at the moment is an understandable reaction to Iraq and Afghanistan. It's interesting to note that we're already looking at another foreign security and military intervention in relation to people smugglers operating out of Libya. So I suspect that this is an issue that will come into greater focus at some point, but not at the moment, I don't think.
Ben?
On the aid budget, to add to what Nigel said, over the last decade, considerable progress has been made in getting the three key security government departments to work together, the MOD, the FCO and DFID. What has often been called the comprehensive approach, and is still widely called that elsewhere. and after some long, hard, difficult evolution of doing this, towards the end of the last two wars, Iraq and Afghanistan, the British were doing this pretty well. For example, the Provincial Reconstruction Team in Helmand. Now, it was hard work to get there. Elements of this have been kept alive. For example, the Interdepartmental Stabilisation Unit. There's also increasing pooling of funds between those three government departments. But with the burning imperative of the Iraq and Afghan wars being over, keeping this alive could be difficult. It could be, it does carry a budgetary cost, and it also carries a cost for people's time. For example, participation on exercises. And there are a number of initiatives that could be taken to actually progress this comprehensive approach, this integrated approach between these three government departments, which would be feasible to make part of the next SDSR. And I think that's an important question for all three government departments, but also for central government, because ultimately there's got to be the will in the central government to make that work.
Then thank you. Doug, anything you want to add to this round, or?
Well, just
Yeah.
on the question on SDSR 2015 and the next NATO summit, I suppose it really depends on when you plan to put the next SDSR into the public domain. If it's full of horrible messages that you're not going to actually be able to deliver what you thought you might, then you're going to wait until after that summit. You're not going to drop it out beforehand. If, on the other hand, you think actually you can make some gestures towards greater NATO security, then you'll put it out in front of it. I think it's a timeline question.
Thank you very much. Let's go to a second round of question. Start here with Desmond Bowen, and then work our way through row 3.
Desmond Bowen, I'm a IISS member. I'd just like to come back to this business of our role in the world. And I recall that last time round there was a sort of notion of undiminished ambition in the world, which wasn't borne out by the facts, I think. And it does seem to me that there is a very different sense of what our security is about. Maybe upstream security is something to do with the aid budget and defence diplomacy, how it's been renamed, but more of it is about security at home, preventing attacks on the homeland, by whoever it might be, and an interest in looking after our own interests. So the activity in the Mediterranean, which is projected at the moment, is actually about our own very, very direct interests. So it's interest rather than values. And it just seems to me that maybe there's a big question to be answered, and maybe you could comment on this, as to whether actually there needs to be a more clarity about what our priorities are, and that it is not the kind of upstream liberal intervention idea, but rather a diminished, more narrow defence of our own interests at home.
Desmond, thank you. Can you just, pass one behind you? Thank you.
David Blair, Daily Telegraph. A question for Ben and for Douglas. If you were looking at conventional military capabilities to restore or enhance in your respective fields, what would your top 2 priorities be?
Thank you. If you could, gentleman here in the third row in the middle.
Thank you, Chairman. Gordon Wilson, fellow of RUSI and also a member here. You may or may not have seen James Rubin's article in the Sunday Times yesterday, and that reflects not just his personal views, but right across the spectrum in the United States, military side, across the political divide, of a real regret at the failure of Britain to meet up to capability and also political will to be much more deeply involved in these issues. Do you perhaps feel that, in spite of what you said, Nigel, that there would be a greater concentration in this, given that the government now is not constrained by coalition politics and therefore can be more free to act? And also, I'd like to add a bit to the whole thing as well, but one of the greatest cooperative arrangements between the United States and Britain after intelligence was in the maritime sphere, and you've gone very light on this one without even having representatives. But that is a way you have much more flexible use of forces. The Americans are very much more willing to have this, and also it's much more easy to deploy than land and air forces. And a tiny little correction to Brigadier Ben, the nuclear forces are not in Rosyth, on the west coast in Glasgow.
Thank you very much. Let's take those three, and then possibly we have time to come back for a final round. Nigel, do you want to start again?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think to pick up Desmond's point first. I mean, if we look back to the 1990s, the post-Cold War, end of history, etc., it is certainly the case that the UK's approach to international humanitarian interventions will appeared to be driven by a much greater sense of altruism and idealism. And I think that some of that has clearly evaporated, partly because of the experiences of the last decade, but I think also partly a function of changing shape and balance of global power. There are new actors in this space. They are actors in the main that place a higher premium on traditional concepts of national sovereignty than has latterly been our wont. And I think these are factors that do, to some extent, shape the current global appetite for international interventionism. So, from that point of view, I think you have a point. Also, of course, if we look at the UK's counter-terrorism policy, this has been very much and understandably focused on defence of the homeland as the first priority. My former services counter-terrorism strategy and policies became those of the security service, the domestic service, precisely because that was so clearly the priority. It would have seemed absurd to do anything else. So I don't think that factor has particularly changed. And if we look at the changes that have taken place in the United States' own counterterrorism policy, from a position a decade ago when the United States was a kind of spider at the center of the web, coordinating activities by a big range of other agencies and organizations around the planet, we've moved to something much more, how should I put it, confederated, in which the emphasis is much more on letting regional and local actors take the lead with the United States in more of a support function than in an active position of leadership. So these things are changing anyway, and it's perhaps unsurprising if we change with them.
Gary.
I just wanted to add to what Nigel said on the question of the place in the world and of political will and things like that. I think the results of the election, particularly the rise of nationalism, both in Scotland and a little bit more in England, and identity politics are really shaping, and I think they really will shape the years going forward, because I think they affect the time, the sense of purpose, and the energy that the UK will have to devote to deciding what sort of power it wants to be in the world. You could argue that strategic shrinkage has already happened. If you look at the Syria vote, you look at the lack of the presence in Ukraine, the limited level of EU involvement, and so on. You can already see a degree of this happening. And if you look out of the foreseeable future, the next 2 years of sort of constitutional navel gazing over the future of Britain in Europe, and now there is a strong link between Britain's future in Europe and the future of the Union because of the political developments in Scotland. All of this, I think, is likely to distract policymakers and sap energy and resolve to act on the world and shape the international realm in a way that Britain hasn't done in the past. And even if Britain does act in the world, the rise of the Scottish nationalists as the third force in British politics, I think, means that even if this does occur, is now going to be subject to tests of legitimacy, right, with political consequence that the country hasn't seen hitherto. So I think these are all significant factors that will affect, if not the letter, perhaps the spirit and the subsequent actualization of the SDSR after it's written.
Okay, thank you. Ben and Doug, you've both been challenged to name your top two by David Blair. So please, Ben, why don't you start?
David, the first thing is that across the armed forces, I would seek to rebuild readiness. That is the ability to do things at short notice. Because this was cut quite significantly in the SDSR. So, for example, the level of ambition for both parachute and amphibious capability was reduced, and the Air Assault Brigade and the Commando Brigade and their associated airlift and shipping are capable of doing less. The second thing is that the readiness for a large-scale operation was extended from 6 months to 1 year. And again, what I think we've seen over the last 5 years is the tempo of events in the world speeding up. And this is partly a result of globalization and partly a result of increased connectivity, particularly media and social media. And reducing readiness goes exactly against that trend. So I'd argue that for the whole of the armed forces. A specific measure for the Army is the Army's equipment program, particularly its armoured vehicle program. Because though the armoured vehicles served it well in Iraq and Afghanistan, they urgently need modernisation in comparison, say, with US, German, French armoured vehicles, and also in comparison with Russian armoured vehicles. That would be my priority. I'd also add a point about the Navy. Now, I'm not attempting to criticise the Navy here, but compared with the Army and the Royal Air Force, the Navy has been subject to far less evolutionary pressure over the last 15 years than the other two services. And there are capabilities that the other two services have and other navies have that the Royal Navy has little or no of. And the two that come to mind are precision munitions that can be fired from warships, and also UAVs, where the Royal Navy, I'm afraid, is well behind the curve compared with the US Navy and other navies.
Ben, thank you. Douglas.
On the Air Force side, without kind of wanting to sound like an armchair wing commander, fast jet fleet size, it's just, we risk, I think, or the UK risks, providing a boutique Air Force, an Air Force which is extremely capable, is extremely well equipped, but actually has no depth in terms of the ability to sustain operations. So I think that there's a need to revisit just the size of the fast jet fleet in the medium term, how big we can actually start to move towards again. The other area is what perhaps I can best describe as a coherent ISR architecture, what the UK would call ISTAR. It's extremely important. The UK has some very good capabilities. A lot of them have been procured ad hoc, and there's actually no coherent structure there. There have been a number of attempts to do this. The latest in the air side was the ISTAR optimization study, which just seems to have disappeared into the long grass. Again, it was a recognition that there needed to be a coherent longer-term plan, but that hasn't so far emerged. I think those are my two areas. And on the naval side, I think Type 26 is hugely important. You know, that's fundamental.
Ben, you wanted to
I'm
add?
conscious we didn't really ask your question about the US. My point about the relative priorities of nuclear forces, intelligence gathering, special forces and conventional forces reflects extensive discussions that we had in the US a few weeks ago. We shouldn't forget, though, that the US did reduce their conventional forces by the best part of about 15 to 20%. I think a question that will be on the mind of many officials in the Pentagon is why, when a range of European nations, Norway, the Netherlands, Poland, Germany and now France, have committed to defence budgeting increases driven by changed strategic circumstances, you know, they'd ask the UK why they don't appear to be seen to want to go in that direction.
Ben, thank you very much. Are there further questions? Yes, please. Fourth row.
Thank you. Julia Moravska from the Avocent Group. My question also falls in this theme of Britain's place in the world and strategic shrinkage more specifically. It would be good to get the panel's views of what it thinks will or might or could reverse this trend, short of perhaps a full-on invasion of a NATO member state. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So what could break the current trends that we are seeing? Further questions? Yes, please. third row in the middle.
Thank you. On nuclear deterrence, are there any proposals that are being considered for as an alternative to the present Trident program for submarines?
Thank you very much. Further questions? Yes, all the way in the back, please.
Hello, from the Swedish Embassy. Just a brief question for Nigel. I just wanted to ask you, there is talk now that you will include the intelligence budget in the defense budget to reach the 2%. Does it matter at all if that's done or not?
Thank you very much. Nigel, do you want to start with that one, since that is a specific
okay. Well, that takes us to the heart of the kind of theology of the Department of Military Analysis, doesn't it? Because what is a defence budget? What are the factors that go into a defence budget? There is no, as far as I'm aware, single, globally accepted definition. And if we look around the world, we see some countries, for example, they calculate defence budget in relation to things like research, scientific and technical research capabilities very differently. China being an obvious example of where that happens. So, I think this is more about theology in some ways than anything else. What matters, to my mind, is the hard numbers. If folding the intelligence budget into the defence budget was a way to covertly reduce the defence budget, or if it had the effect of altering the kind of command and control mechanisms for the intelligence services, I think the last thing we would want is for the intelligence services to revert to being something as it was at the end of the last century, that was seen as an almost exclusively military preserve. It's very much more wide-ranging than that. So I certainly wouldn't want to see the single intelligence vote becoming part of the MOD budget, or coming under the purview of the Secretary of State for Defence. But subject to that, and subject to it not being a covert exercise in cutting back the numbers, I don't think that's such an issue, unless I'm missing something. Maybe.
Nigel, thank you. Well, let's ask an economist how he feels about this. Giri, please.
Thanks, Bastian. On the question of definition, I'd say that what really matters is the NATO definition, right? So even if you included the intelligence budget, for your domestic purposes into the defense budget, when you make that submission to NATO, they will do their due diligence and work out what is the intelligence portion of the equation, and that will not be counted. And so, as a consequence, you could try to fudge it, but effectively, you will not be living up to your commitments, and you would be exposed as not being able to do that. So I don't think it's a quick fix. The other thing to say is that I don't think we should overstate the increases that are happening in Europe at the moment. I think there are some who think that simply because increases are being announced over a multi-year period, I don't think that actually tells us the whole picture, because even if you take the German increase, which is pretty significant, the reality is that if you take those numbers and you compare that over to the increase in German GDP that the IMF projects, right? And by the end of this decade, Germany will be spending a smaller proportion of GDP on defense than it currently is. So people have announced multi-year budgets into the out years, but it's likely that they won't keep pace with GDP. And so I think we need to be careful of the metric. The metrics that matter in Europe are those who have announced increases to 2020 of the proportion of GDP that they will allocate to defense. So places like Lithuania and Latvia, places like that. So people who have committed to a percentage of GDP target, then you can be sure that that's a real meaningful commitment in a multi-year sense. Thanks.
But of course, in those examples, referring to very small
budgets
in total terms.
Yeah.
So therefore not shifting the overall
balance,
picture in Europe. Giri, thank you. Ben and Doug, can I ask you to say a few words on if you have any thoughts on the nuclear question, and also on what would reverse the trend? What, in other words, what would need to happen to shift the picture?
Firstly, politics. The Democratic Unionist Party put in its manifesto meeting the 2% commitment. There are many conservative backbenchers who are very uneasy about pledging the hard overseas aid target but not meeting the NATO 2% commitment. And of course, governments with thin majorities can see the majorities fade away during the course of their term. And at some stage, those actors might choose to put pressure on the government about defence. But what I suspect was behind your question was the question of a strategic shock. Well, I think there are two sorts of strategic shock that could do this. One would be a major cyber attack along the lines of the cyber attack experienced by Estonia in the previous decade, but with fingerprints all over it of a state sponsoring. And I'm talking here about the kind of cyber attack that makes it impossible to draw money from cash machines, that shuts down supermarkets, for example, that seriously damages the financial transaction network that we all depend on and the city depends on. I think that's one sort of strategic shock. The other one would be something of the same impact as 9/11. I mean, for example, a Mumbai or Westgate Mall style attack. And I would hope that the government, the police, the Home Office and the armed services are already hard at work at improving their response to that sort of threat. The second one would be a major incident overseas that involved significant numbers of UK deaths. You know, something, for example, that might involve, say, a cruise ship, an airliner, a holiday resort frequented by a lot of Britons. And again, whether that was a non-state actor or whether there was a smoking gun that led back to states. But I think in the short term, it's only that sort of shock that's going to cause a fundamental reappraisal.
Just on that point, the question of fundamental reappraisal, I also think that a continuing deterioration in terms of relationships with Moscow, will these to continue in a downward trend, I think, over a few years, I think could make the situation so uncomfortable that people might be forced to revisit defence assumptions in terms of spending. On the nuclear side, there has been study work done in the past. They looked at a variety of delivery systems alternative to ballistic missiles. From submarines, they looked at air-launched cruise missiles, submarine-launched cruise missiles, even a land-based ballistic missile. And the outcome was that the submarine-launched ballistic missile provided the most cost-effective approach. There was, however, a kind of lack of opacity of the figures, I think, in terms of the costings, which I would have liked to have seen some more detail on, but that wasn't forthcoming. At the moment, as far as I'm aware, there is no alternative study work being considered at all, and that it's the continuous at-sea deterrent is the selected method.
Douglas, thank you very much. I don't see any further pressing questions, and that gives me the opportunity to bring this to a close at exactly 1 p.m., which is obviously very nice. I think, you know, we put a lot on the table for this 1 hour. I think, you know, some of the issues have become pretty clear. I think the different demands pulling in one direction, which has been outlined as deterrence, intelligence, and soft versus a conventional requirement that some other allies might feel very strongly about, is one way to look at this. We've talked about the spending picture. So I think as we as further details about the process that the government intends to conduct become available, I think these will be questions that will guide us through that process. I think it has become clear that whatever the SDSR process looks like, it would benefit in the end. I think that's what I would take away from consultation and a sort of a process that does not completely rush it, because I think that threat assessment that has been talked about, that's an interesting question which should go ahead, or should come in front of some of the other issues that were put on the table. So I'd like to thank you very much for joining us, and it was a pleasure to have you all. Please let us thank the speakers in the usual way and give them a round of applause.